Welcome back, fellow dissidents. This is going to be part 3 of the first installment of the Dissident Book Club. This one being particularly Rothbard's For New Liberty. So, the first two parts were essentially establishing the natural rights theory as well as the heritage of the libertarian theory and just the basically making the case of where it comes from historically and also how and where it's embedded in. And so without further ado, we'll just jump right into it, because this part specifically starts to get into the questions of the state, its legitimacy, and the idea of quote-unquote authority. So, starting with part 3, chapter 3, the state. The state as aggressor. The central thrust of libertarian thought, then, is to oppose any and all aggression against the property rights of individuals in their own persons and in the material objects they have voluntarily acquired. You're going to see that word a lot throughout this reading, all of the readings of Rothbard specifically, but voluntary. That's actually a utilitarian wordplay on anarchism, libertarianism, and that's voluntarism. Some people call it voluntarism, but voluntary, very, very important. All right, voluntarily acquired, continuing on. While individual and gangs of criminals are, of course, opposed, there is nothing unique here to the libertarian creed, since almost all persons and schools of thought oppose the exercise of random violence against persons and property. Not all, though. If you look at the more leftist movements or any socialist movements, even the ones of the quote-unquote right variety, the nationalist socialists, they lure folks in with the idea of utopia and liberty, but you never get that with socialism. And socialism and communism, regardless of their fascism, regardless of their variety, they are always inherently tied to the state. That's why I find it absolutely absurd and just absurd on its face that people try to tie anarcho-capitalists or voluntarists to the label fascist. This is obviously a straw man caricature, because without the state, you cannot have fascism. So therefore, that makes libertarian ideology exempt from that label. Continuing on. There is, however, a difference of emphasis on the part of libertarians, even in this universally accepted area of defending people against crime. In the libertarian society, there would be no, quote, district attorney, unquote, who prosecutes criminals in the name of a non-existent society, even against the wishes of the victim of crime. The victim would himself decide whether to press charges. Furthermore, as another side to the same coin, in a libertarian world, the victim would be able to press suit against a wrongdoer without having to convince the same district attorney that he should proceed. Moreover, in the system of criminal punishment in the libertarian world, the emphasis would never be, as it is now, on society's quote-unquote jailing the criminal. The emphasis would necessarily be on compelling the criminal to make restitution to the victim of his crime. Stopping there to interject, that is a very important distinction of this amorphous blob we call society that everybody pays their debt to. In a libertarian society, not only would everything be more efficient, productive, and voluntary above all, but it would be focused on restitution, and those restitutions could be there would be a law developed that would be focused on deterring folks through restitution. So a thief would pay, as an example, could theoretically pay twice the costs and fees acquired, something to that effect, to deter folks from being thieves. So there would still be the deterring agent, but the necessary prerequisite would be that whatever the crime committed, it would be to pay restitution to the victim. That's huge, that can't be understated. Moving on. The present system, in which the victim is not recompensed but instead has to pay taxes to support the incarceration of his own attacker, would be evident nonsense in a world that focuses on the defense of property rights and therefore on the victim of the crime. Furthermore, while most libertarians are not pacifists, they would not join the present system in interfering with people's right to be pacifists. Thus, suppose that Jones, a pacifist, is aggressed against by Smith, a criminal. If Jones, as the result of his beliefs, is against defending himself by the use of violence and is therefore opposed to any prosecution of the crime, then Jones will simply fail to prosecute, and that will be the end of it. There will be no governmental machinery that pursues and tries criminals even against the wishes of the victim. But the critical difference between libertarians and other people is not in the area of private crime. The critical difference is their view of the role of the state, the government. For libertarians regard the state as the supreme, the eternal, the best organized aggressor against the persons and property of the mass of the public. All states, everywhere, whether democratic, dictatorial, or monarchical, whether red, white, or blue, or brown. The state, exclamation point for emphasis. The state, always and ever the government and its rulers and operators have been considered above the general moral law. The Pentagon Papers are only one recent instance among the innumerable instances in history of men, most of whom are perfectly honorable in their private lives, who lie in their teeth before the public. Remember, this was published in the mid-70s, late to mid-70s. Why? For reasons of state, quote-unquote. Service to the state is supposed to excuse all actions that would be considered immoral or criminal if committed by private citizens. The distinctive feature of libertarians is that they coolly and uncompromisingly apply the general moral law to people acting in their roles as members of the state apparatus. Libertarians make no exceptions. For centuries, the state, or more strictly, individuals acting in their roles as members of the government, has cloaked its criminal activity in high-sounding rhetoric. For centuries, the state has committed mass murder and called it war, then ennobled the mass slaughter that war involves. For centuries, the state has enslaved people into its armed battalions and called it conscription in the national service. For centuries, the state has robbed people at bayonet point and called it taxation. In fact, if you wish to know how libertarians regard the state and any of its acts, simply think of the state as a criminal band, and all of the libertarian attitudes will logically fall into place. And this is me interjecting here, but this is the one caricature straw man that people are brainwashed to accept about libertarians, that we just believe in utopia. No, the most utopian view is that you can give government power and then it will restrain itself from using it or exercising that said power. When in fact, if you think of the immoral actions of aggressing against someone's person or property, if you just add that to the government, everything falls in line. And people act like this is just absurd, that there has to be some exception for government, and in fact there has to be a government. That is the utopian view. The utopian view is that there is a such thing as limited government. There absolutely is not, and historically there has never been a precedent set that shows you that it can work. Moving forward, let us consider, for example, what it is that sharply distinguishes government from all other organizations in society. Many political scientists and sociologists have blurred this vital distinction and refer to all organizations and groups as hierarchical, structured, governmental, etc. Left-wing anarchists, for example, will oppose equally government and private organizations such as corporations on the ground that each is equally elitist and coercive. But the rightist libertarian, quote-unquote, is not opposed to inequality, and his concept of coercion applies only to the use of violence. The libertarian sees a crucial distinction between government, whether central, state, or local, and all other institutions in society, or rather two crucial distinctions. First, Every other person or group receives its income by voluntary payment, either by voluntary contribution or gift, such as the local community chest or bridge club, or by voluntary purchase of its goods or services on the market, i.e., grocery store owner, baseball player, steel manufacturer, etc. Only the government obtains its income by coercion and violence, i.e., by the direct threat of confiscation or imprisonment if payment is not forthcoming. This coerced levy is taxation. A second distinction is that, apart from criminal outlaws, only the government can use its funds to commit violence against its own or any other subjects. Only the government can prohibit pornography, compel a religious observance, or put people in jail for selling goods at a higher price than the government deems fit. Both distinctions, of course, can be summed up as: only the government in society is empowered to aggress against the property rights of its subjects, whether to extract revenue, to impose its moral code, or to kill those with whom it disagrees. Furthermore, any and all governments, even the least despotic, have always obtained the bulk of their income from the coercive taxing power, and historically, by far the overwhelming proportion of all enslavement and murder in the history of the world has come from the hands of government. And since we have seen that the central thrust of the libertarian is to oppose all aggression against the rights of person and property, the libertarian necessarily opposes the institution of the state as the inherent and overwhelmingly the most important enemy of those precious rights. There is another reason why state aggression has been far more important than private, a reason apart from the greater organization and central mobilizing of resources that the rulers of the state can impose. The reason is the absence of any check upon state depredation, a check that does exist when we have to worry about muggers or the mafia. To guard against private criminals, we have been able to turn to the state and its police. But who can guard us against the state itself? No one. For another critical distinction of the state is that it compels the monopolization of the service of protection. The state arrogates to itself a virtual monopoly of violence and of ultimate decision-making in society. If we don't like the decisions of the state courts, for example, there are no other agencies of protection to which we may turn. It is true that in the United States, at least, we have a constitution that imposes strict limits on some powers of government, but, as we have discovered in the past century, no constitution can interpret or enforce itself. It must be interpreted by men. And if the ultimate power to interpret a constitution is given to the government's own Supreme Court, then the inevitable tendency is for the court to continue to place its imprimatur on even broader powers for its own government. Furthermore, the highly touted, quote, checks and balances, unquote, and separation of powers, quote unquote, in the American government are flimsy indeed, since in the final analysis all of these divisions are part of the same government and are governed by the same set of rulers. Interjecting, this idea, this fallacy, it's not even an idea. Don't get me wrong, the idea of a constitution and the fallacies that are surrounding it, it was a brilliant attempt at liberty, but it was ensconced and pushed forward by hardcore centralizers of power, and the fallacies of liberty therein the Constitution were just that. They were fallacies. There are no checks and balances because at the end of the day, it's the government checking itself. You cannot hand a centralized authority, quote unquote, if you so choose, full of bureaucrats. You cannot hand them you cannot cede your sovereignty to them at all in reality, but you cannot pretend to cede your sovereignty to this central body and then expect them not to exercise that sovereignty and the coercion and power over top of you. They will not limit themselves. At the end of the day, there is not an amorphous blob called government. There are individuals who act inside of government. And just like anybody, we all have our own inherent reasons for why we act. Read Ludwig von Mises and human action. Every single human acts on his own behalf for his own reasons. Same for the people inside of centralized government. So if you hand them centralized power, their inherent incentive is to expand that power for their own reasons. Whether it be malevolent or incompetent is of no relevance. You cannot hand a centralized state power and expect it not to expand. Continuing on. One of America's most brilliant political theorists, John C. Calhoun, wrote prophetically of the inherent tendency of a state to break through the limits of its written constitution. Excuse me. A written constitution certainly has many and considerable advantages, but it is a great mistake to suppose that the mere insertion of provisions to restrict and limit the powers of the government, without investing those for whose protection they are inserted with the means of enforcing their observance, will be sufficient to prevent the major and dominant party from abusing its powers. Being the party in possession of the government, they will be in favor of the powers granted by the Constitution and opposed to the restrictions intended to limit them. As the major and dominant parties, they will have no need of these restrictions for their protection. The minor or weaker party, on the contrary, would take the opposite direction and regard them as essential to their protection against the dominant party. But where there are no means by which they could compel the major party to observe the restrictions, the only resort left them would be a strict construction of the Constitution. To this, the major party would oppose a liberal construction, one which would give to the words of the grant the broadest meaning of which they were susceptible. It would then be construction against construction, the one to contract and the other to enlarge the powers of the government to the utmost. But of what possible avail could the strict construction of the minority party be against the liberal interpretation of the major, when the one would have all the powers of the government to carry its construction into effect, and the other be deprived of all means of enforcing its construction? In a contest so unequal, the result would not be doubtful. The party in favor of the restrictions would be overpowered. The end of the contest would be the subversion of the Constitution. The restrictions would ultimately be annulled, and the government be converted into one of unlimited powers, i.e. the United States circa 2022? Question mark. Nor would the division of government into separate and, as it regards each other, independent departments prevent this result, as each and all the departments, and of course the entire government, would be under the control of the numerical majority. It is too clear to require explanation that a mere distribution of its powers among its agents or representatives could do little or nothing to counteract its tendency to oppression and abuse of power. Now that's John C. Calhoun, which I personally have a few of his extended works on states' rights. And what I'll say there is, one, you typically get left-leaning individuals who say that he was arguing for the fact of slavery. This is a caricature. I mean, he was arguing about government in his time, and one of the arguments of that time was slavery, but it wasn't even the major argument. 5% of people owned slaves. It was not, most people were bigoted and racist. The North did not go in to liberate African American folks. That's not what the case was. Even in, the Civil War, that's not what the primary ideal was. Sure, it may have broke out over slavery. That may have been one of the primary reasons why it started, but there was a buildup of fundamental oppression and tyranny being provided by the centralized government. They never called it the national government. They always called it the central or common government. That was the government that was supposed to have binded them all together, not hierarchically at the top. This is an argument that John C. Calhoun espouses in his disquisition of government. And they always caricature these people who argued about and around government of that time to link it to slavery of some sort. And number two, he was arguing for states' rights, and this is the idea that the sovereignty was held by the people themselves. There wasn't this amorphous blob, as I keep saying, that is the centralized state. No, there was the sovereignty of the people who decided to opt into contract with a government, and that was what a state was. It wasn't a state like the square box of Colorado or whatever. That's not what a state was to people back then. It was people opting into a contract of representative government, and then there was an even more central government to link all of those people together. And the mechanism of government was never supposed to be a hierarchical, top-down, oppressive, tyrannical state. But this is the idea that's being expounded here, is that you cannot stop that from being the propaganda and rhetoric of the people inside of the government for their own benefit. It's a fairly simple idea if you think about it long enough. This is why we're reading For a New Liberty. All of these fundamental ideas need to be espoused to people who have never heard them before, because from kindergarten all the way up, it's an indivisible nation under God. It is divisible, and in fact it is divided. And it should be, all the way down to the individual, as we shall see. Proceeding forward. But why worry about the weakness of limits on governmental power, especially in a, quote, democracy, unquote, in the phrase so often used by American liberals in their heyday before the mid-1960s, when doubts began to creep into the liberal utopia? Are we not the government? In the phrase, we are the government, the useful collective term we has enabled an ideological camouflage to be thrown over the naked exploitative reality of political life. For if we truly are the government, then anything a government does to an individual is not only just and not tyrannical, it is also voluntary on the part of the individual concerned. If the government has incurred a huge public debt which must be paid by taxing one group on behalf of another, this reality of burden is conveniently obscured by blithely saying that we owe it to ourselves. But who are the we and who the ourselves? If the government drafts a man, or even throws him into jail for dissident opinions, then he is only doing it to himself, and therefore nothing improper has occurred. Under this reasoning, then, Jews murdered by the Nazi government were not murdered. They must have committed suicide, since they were the government, which was democratically chosen, and therefore anything the government did to them was only voluntary on their part. But there is no way out of such grotesqueries for those supporters of government who see the state merely as a benevolent and voluntary agent of the public. You see how ridiculous this fundamental argument is, that it's in a government for the people, by the people. That's not the fucking case. That's just a remedial way of looking at things. It's propagandistic rhetoric used by the state to indoctrinate you and your children. Moving forward. And so we must conclude that we are not the government. The government is not us. The government does not, in any accurate sense, represent the majority of the people, but even if it did, even if 90% of the people decided to murder or enslave the other 10%, this would still be murder and slavery, and would not be voluntary suicide or enslavement on the part of the oppressed minority. Crime is crime. Aggression against rights is aggression, no matter how many citizens agree to the oppression. There is nothing sacrosanct about the majority. The lynch mob, too, is the majority in its own domain. But while, as in the lynch mob, the majority can become actively tyrannical and aggressive, the normal and continuing condition of the state is oligarchic rule, ruled by a coercive elite which has managed to gain the control of the state machinery. There are two basic reasons for this. One is the inequality and division of labor inherent in the nature of man, which gives rise to an iron law of oligarchy in all of man's activities. And second is the parasitic nature of the state enterprise itself. The second one I have already discussed at length, interjection. This idea that we can eradicate inequality, this idea of equity, this idea of opportunity of outcome is absolutely a leftist idea, and you can figure out if someone is quote unquote in contemporary terms left or right. Just ask them, are some people better than other people? It's that simple. If they say yes, then they are in contemporary terms right-leaning. It's that simple. If they try to justify it or re-ration the question or try to rationalize why they need to further delve into what the question means, then they are inherently left-leaning and will try to argue as such. Just ask somebody, are some people better than others? I mean, it's very simple. Look at LeBron James. Is he not fucking one of the most valuable basketball players in that association of people? Of course he is. Regardless if you like his China hawk, this Chinese rhetoric and this woke bullshit that he espouses. Put all that to the side. When it comes to basketball, is he not indeed better than a majority of folks on the court? You can make the case, but that's not what we're arguing. Yes, he is. And that is the case no matter how you want to rationalize it. Some folks are better than others. It's a fact of life. Simple. Moving on. We have said that the individualist is not an egalitarian. Part of the reason for this is the individualist's insight into the vast diversity and individuality within mankind, a diversity that has the chance to flower and expand as civilization and living standards progress. Individuals differ in ability and in interest both within and between occupations, and hence in all occupations and walks of life, whether it be steel production or the organization of a bridge club, leadership in the activity will inevitably be assumed by a relative handful of the most able and energetic, while the remaining majority will form themselves into rank and file followers. This truth applies to all activities, whether they are beneficial or malevolent, as in criminal organizations. Indeed, the discovery of the iron law of oligarchy was made by the Italian socialist Robert Michels, who found that the Social Democratic Party of Germany, despite the rhetorical commitment to egalitarianism, was rigidly oligarchical and hierarchical in its actual functioning. And this is every socialist state. Even the Soviet Union, no matter what, there will be people who flourish in that system, and they will rise to the top in a small minority and control the rest who file in rank. It's very, very simple. This is not debatable. People want to change this and profess some utopia that can be brought about, but this is all not reality. This is why people who are libertarian anarchists, we don't profess utopia. We just profess ideas that would lead to the most prosperous among any ideas that we have. The market will solve problems that nothing else can solve because we don't get utopia as humans. We live inside consciousness of the human condition. There's no out for us. Maybe technology fixes that in the future, theoretically. We don't know. But as it sits right now, we need the market to even think about getting to there. But we're humans. We don't get utopia. Look at the universe. There's destruction and chaos everywhere, but it's beautiful, ordered nature if it just is allowed to do what it does. Why would that be any different for us? A second basic reasoning for the oligarchic rule of the state is its parasitic nature, the fact that it lives coercively off the production of the citizenry. To be successful to its practitioners, the fruits of parasitic exploitation must be confined to a relative minority. Otherwise, a meaningless plunder of all by all would result in no gains for anyone. That's where we're at today. That's my interjection. Nowhere has the coercive and parasitic nature of the state been more clearly limbed than by the great late 19th century German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer. I will interject here. He's got a book called The State. I highly recommend it. Franz Oppenheimer, The State. Oppenheimer pointed out that there are two and only two mutually exclusive means for man to obtain wealth. One, the method of production and voluntary exchange, the method of the free market, Oppenheimer termed the, quote, economic means. The other, the method of robbery by the use of violence, he called the political means, quote unquote. The political means is clearly parasitic, for it requires previous production for the exploiters to confiscate, and it subtracts from instead of adding to the total production in society. Oppenheimer then proceeded to define the state as the organization of the political means, the systematization of the predatory process over a given territorial area. And that is from that book, The State. In short, private crime is at best sporadic and uncertain. The parasitism is ephemeral, and the coercive parasitic lifeline can be cut at any time by the resistance of the victims. The state provides a legal, orderly, systematic channel for predation on the property of the producers. It makes certain, secure, and relatively peaceful the lifeline of the parasitic caste in society. The great libertarian writer Albert J. Nock wrote vividly that, quote, The state claims and exercises the monopoly of crime. It forbids private murder, but itself organizes murder on a colossal scale. It punishes private theft, but itself lays unscrupulous hands on anything it wants, whether the property of citizen or of alien, unquote. That's another great book. Albert J. Nock in the footnotes here on Doing the Right Thing and other essays. Albert J. Nock being one of the early 20th century libertarian writers. Great stuff there, especially when it comes to education. Excuse me. At first, of course, it is startling for someone to consider taxation as robbery, and therefore government as a band of robbers. But anyone who persists in thinking of taxation as, in some sense, a voluntary payment can see what happens if he chooses not to pay. The great economist Joseph Schumpeter, himself by no means a libertarian, wrote that the state has been living on a revenue which was being produced in the private sphere for private purposes and had to be deflected from the purposes by political force. The theory which construes taxes on the analogy of club dues or of the purchases of the services of, say, a doctor only proves how far removed this part of the social sciences is from the scientific habits of mind. The eminent Viennese legal positivist Hans Kelsen attempted, in his treatise The General Theory of Law and the State, to establish a political theory and justification of the state on a strictly quote-unquote scientific and value-free basis. What happened is that early in the book, he came to the crucial sticking point, the pons asinorum of political philosophy. What distinguishes the edicts from the state, from the commands of a bandit gang? Kelsen's answer was simply to say that the decrees of the state are quote-unquote valid, and to proceed happily from there without bothering to define or explain this concept of validity. Indeed, it would be a useful exercise for non-libertarians to ponder this question: how can you define taxation in a way which makes it different from robbery? I do this all the time while I'm critiquing our current government here in the United States, whether at local, state, or national level. I often ask, I try my best to provoke people and their minds to lead them to libertarian ideals. It's like the Kevin Hart meme, don't worry, I'll wait. It's like, explain to me how taxation is not theft. Try to define taxation to somebody like me who agrees with none of it. How do you justify that they are not stealing my money by coercion and theft? Don't worry, I'll wait. To the great 19th century individualist anarchist and constitutional lawyer, Lysander Spooner, my personal hero, there was no problem in finding the answer. Spooner's analysis of the state as robber group is perhaps the most devastating ever written. This is possibly my favorite libertarian passage of all time. It goes the furthest at showing why libertarians run around with shirts that say taxation is theft and why we understand the state as a group of robber barons. Here we go. It is true that the theory of our Constitution is that all taxes are paid voluntarily, that our government is a mutual insurance company voluntarily entered into by the people with each other. But this theory of our government is wholly different from the practical fact. The fact is that the government, like a highwayman, say to a man, your money or your life, and many, if not most, taxes are paid under the compulsion of that threat. The government does not, indeed, waylay a man in a lonely place, spring upon him from the roadside, and holding a pistol to his head proceed to rifle his pockets. But the robbery is nonetheless a robbery on that account, and it is far more dastardly and shameful. This is the devastating part here. The highwayman takes solely upon himself the responsibility, danger, and crime of his own act. He does not pretend that he has any rightful claim to your money, or that he intends to use it for your own benefit. He does not pretend to be anything but a robber. He has not acquired impudence enough to profess to be merely a protector, and that he takes men's money against their will merely to enable him to protect those infatuated travelers who feel perfectly able to protect themselves or do not appreciate his peculiar system of protection. He is too sensible a man to make such professions as these. Furthermore, having taken your money, he leaves you as you wish him to do. He does not persist in following you on the road against your will, assuming to be your rightful quote-unquote sovereign on account of the quote-unquote protection he affords you. He does not keep quote-unquote protecting you by commanding you to bow down and serve him, by requiring you to do this and forbidding you to do that, by robbing you of more money as often as he finds it for his interest or pleasure to do so, and by branding you as a rebel, a traitor, and an enemy to your country, and shooting you down without mercy if you dispute his authority or resist his demands. He is too much of a gentleman to be guilty of such impostures and insults and villainies as these. In short, he does not, in addition to robbing you, attempt to make you either his dupe or his slave. And the implication there is that is exactly what the state does. They steal your money, they conscript your children, and they say it's all for your own good. Shut the hell up, serf. Continuing on. If the state is a group of plunderers, who then constitutes the state? Clearly, the ruling elite consists at any time of A, the full-time apparatus, the kings, politicians, and bureaucrats who man and operate the state, and B, the groups who have maneuvered to gain privileges, subsidies, and benefices from the state. The remainder of society constitutes the ruled. It was, again, John C. Calhoun who saw with crystal clarity that no matter how small the power of government, no matter how low the tax burden or how equal its distribution, the very nature of government creates two unequal and inherently conflicting classes in society: those who on net pay the taxes, the taxpayers, and those who on net live off taxes, the tax consumers. Suppose that the government imposes a low and seemingly equally distributed tax to pay for building a dam. This very act takes money from the most of the public to pay it out to the net tax consumers, the bureaucrats who run the operation, the contractors and workers who build the dam, etc. And the greater the scope of government decision-making, the greater its fiscal burdens, Calhoun went on, the greater the burden and the artificial inequality it imposes between these two classes. John C. Calhoun continues on. Few, comparatively as they are, the agents and employees of the government constitute that proportion of the community who are the exclusive recipients of the proceeds of the taxes. Whatever amount is taken from the community in the form of taxes, if not lost, goes to them in the shape of expenditures and disbursements. The two, disbursement and taxation, constitute the fiscal action of the government. They are correlatives. What the one takes from the community under the name of taxes is transferred to the portion of the community who are the recipients under that of disbursements. But as the recipients constitute only a portion of the community, it follows, taking the two parts of the fiscal process together, that its actions must be unequal between the payers of the taxes and the recipients of their proceeds. Nor can it be otherwise, unless what is collected from each individual in the shape of taxes shall be returned to him in that of disbursements, which would make the process nugatory and absurd. The necessary result, then, of the unequal fiscal action of the government is to divide the community into two great classes, one consisting of those who in reality pay the taxes and of course bear exclusively the burden of supporting the government, and the other of those who are the recipients of their proceeds through disbursements and who are in fact supported by the government, or in fewer words, to divide it into taxpayers and tax consumers. But the effect of this is to place them in antagonistic relationships in reference to the fiscal action of the government, and the entire course of policy therewith connected. For the greater the taxes and disbursements, the greater gain of the one and the loss of the other, and vice versa. Then, the effect then of every increase is to enrich and strengthen the one and to impoverish and weaken the other. And as he explained, it cannot be otherwise. This is the function of taxation and redistribution. Otherwise, why would they take your money to give it back to you in services? If you got back what you already wanted, it would make it nugatory and absurd. It's not voluntary. It's not what you need. Continuing on, if states have everywhere been run by an oligarchic group of predators, How have they been able to maintain their rule over the mass of the population? The answer, as the philosopher David Hume pointed out over 2 centuries ago, is that in the long run, every government, no matter how dictatorial, rests on the support of the majority of its subjects. Listen closely. Now, this does not, of course, render these governments voluntary, since the very existence of the tax and other coercive power shows how much compulsion the state must exercise, nor does the majority support have to be eager and enthusiastic approval. It could well be mere passive acquiescence and resignation. The conjunction in the famous phrase, death and taxes, implies a passive and resigned acceptance to the assumed inevitability of the state and its taxation. It's not voluntary. People just make it seem that way in rhetoric. Continuing on. The tax consumers, the groups that benefit from the operations of the state, will of course be eager rather than passive followers of the state mechanism, but these are only a minority. How is the compliance and acquiescence of the mass of the population to be secured? Here we come to the central problem of political philosophy, that branch of philosophy that deals with politics, the exercise of regularized violence, the mystery of civil disobedience. Why do people obey the edicts and depredations of the ruling elite? Conservative writer James Burnham, who is the reverse of a libertarian, put the problem very clearly, admitting that there is no rational justification for civil obedience. Neither the source nor the justification of government can be put in wholly rational terms. Why should I accept the hereditary or democratic or any other principle of legitimacy? Why should a principle justify the rule of the man over me? Unquote. You shouldn't. That's the whole point. His own answer is hardly calculated to convince many others. Quote, I accept the principle. Well, because I do. Because that is the way it is and has been. Yeah, that's not rational, as he explained. It doesn't need to be. As long as you can rhetorically make it possible and feasible, that's all that matters. That's all the state is rhetorically feasible. It's not justifiable. It's not necessary. It's not voluntary. It's just rhetorically feasible. And until people understand that, we'll never get rid of it. Continuing on. But suppose that one does not accept the principle. What will the way, quote unquote, be then? And why have the bulk of subjects agreed to accept it? Now, this is the important part on the rhetoric of government. All right. This section entitled The State and the Intellectuals, your vanguard of statists. This is your modern day social media people, whether conservative or liberal, telling you that their brand of statism will deliver liberal or liberty and status and prosperity. Just give them your liberty and we will return it to you tenfold. Yeah. It's not the case. It's not the case. They've just been indoctrinated to believe that the system is either necessary or wanted. The state and the intellectuals. The answer is that since the early origins of the state, its rulers have always turned, as a necessary bolster to their rule, to an alliance with society's class of intellectuals. The masses do not create their own abstract ideas, or indeed think through these ideas independently. They follow passively the ideas adopted and promulgated by the body of intellectuals, who become the effective, quote, opinion molders, unquote, in society. And since it's precisely a molding of opinion on behalf of the rulers that the state almost desperately needs, this forms a firm basis for the age-old alliance of the intellectuals and the ruling classes of the state. The alliance is based on quid pro quo. On the one hand, the intellectuals spread among the masses the idea that the state and its rulers are wise, good, sometimes divine, and at the very least inevitable and better than any conceivable alternatives. In return for this panoply of ideology, the state incorporates the intellectuals as part of the ruling elite, granting them power, status, prestige, and material security. Furthermore, intellectuals are needed to staff the bureaucracy and to, quote-unquote, plan the economy and society. Before the modern era, particularly potent among the intellectual handmaidens of the state, was the priestly caste, cementing the powerful and terrible alliance of warrior chief and medicine man, of throne and altar. The state established, quote-unquote, the church, and conferred upon it power, prestige, and wealth extracted from its subjects. In return, the church anointed the state with divine sanction and inculcated the sanction into the populace. In the modern era, when the theocratic arguments have lost most of their luster among the public, the intellectuals have posed as the scientific cadre of quote-unquote experts. Man, that's fucking relevant in 2022, huh? Yeah. The scientific cadre of quote-unquote experts and have been busy informing the hapless public that political affairs, foreign and domestic, are much too complex for the average person to bother about in his head. Only the state and its corps of intellectual experts, planners, scientists, economists, and national security managers can possibly hope to deal with these problems. The role of the masses, even in quote-unquote democracies, is to ratify and assent the decisions of their knowledgeable rulers, i.e. Anthony Fauci. I mean, he is the science, right? When people hate on Fauci, they're hating on science itself, correct? Because he is the science. There you go. Not much more needs to be stated in today's. That's why this book is so important, because it's still relevant today, even some almost 50 years fucking later. It's absolutely absurd that people haven't woke up to the idea that the state is not only unnecessary, but it's oppressive and tyrannical with this dangling fruit in front of your treadmill of some amount of freedom or liberty. We don't actually have that. We do have a centrally planned economy, and the markets operate in spite of that. Excuse me for my vociferous interjection, but I cannot stand this idea that it's necessary, let alone that we don't need to abolish the entire fucking thing. We need a national divorce immediately. Continuing on. Historically, the union of church and state, of throne and altar, has been the most effective device for inducing obedience and support among the subjects. Burnham attests to the power of myth and mystery in inducing support when he writes that, quote, in ancient times, before the illusions of science had corrupted traditional wisdom, the founders of cities were known to be gods or demigods, unquote. That hasn't really much changed today. It's just not in the theocratic language. They're not using the linguistics of the Abrahamic tradition. But they are, in fact, considering themselves to be above you. And should you dissent against them, you're labeled fascists, extremists, and domestic terrorists and all this extra shit. They are, in fact, saying that there is an apartheid class and they are above you. It's never changed. It's just changed in rhetoric, which is why this book is so damn important. To establish the priestcraft, the ruler was either anointed by God, or in the case of the absolute rule of many Oriental despotisms, was even himself God. Hence, any questioning or resistance to his rule would be blasphemy. Many and subtle are the ideological weapons of the state, and its intellectuals have used over the centuries to induce their subjects to accept their rule. One excellent weapon has been the power of tradition. The longer lasting the rule of any given state, the more powerful this weapon. Excuse me. For then the X dynasty or the Y state has the seeming weight of centuries of tradition behind it. Worship of one's ancestors then becomes a none too subtle means of cultivating worship of one's ancestral rulers. The force, and we see this today with our founding fathers. It was a brilliant attempt at government, but it doesn't mean it was right. It doesn't mean we should hold them up as sacrosanct or something. That's not the case. We should look and appreciate our history, but it's not at all what conservatives claim it to be. And it's not the caricature that's painted by the left either. You have to look at revisionist history as what it is. It's just that. It's history. It's not to be revered. It's to be understood. The force of tradition is, of course, bolstered by ancient habit, which confirms the subjects in the seeming propriety and legitimacy of the ruler under which they live. Thus, the political theorist Bertrand de Jouvenel has written, the essential reason for obedience is that it has become a habit of the species. Power is for us a fact of nature. From the earliest days of recorded history, it has always presided over human destinies. The authorities which ruled in former times did not disappear without bequeathing to their successors the privilege, nor without leaving in men's minds imprints which are cumulative in their effect. The succession of governments which, in the course of centuries, rule the same society may be looked on as one underlying government which takes on continuous accretions. Another potent ideological force is for the state to deprecate the individual and exalt either the past or present collectivity of society. Any isolated voice, any raiser of new doubts can then be attacked as a profane violator of the wisdom of his ancestors. This is what if you try to quote anti-federalists against the federalists, you will get this. Oh, you're fringe, and Hamilton was something to be revered or something. When in fact everything the anti-federalists said came to fruition. So it's not as if it wasn't brilliant. It's not as if they were wrong in their time and place to try this government. It's just that it is what it is. It is history that is to be understood. Any isolated voice, any raiser of new doubts, can then be attacked as profane violator in the wisdom of his ancestors. Moreover, any new idea, much less any new critical idea, must necessarily begin as a small minority opinion. Therefore, in order to ward off any potentially dangerous idea from threatening majority acceptance of its rule, the state will try to nip the new idea in the bud by ridiculing any view that sets itself against massed opinion. Has that changed today? Just a question. The ways in which the state rulers in ancient Chinese despotism used religion as a method of binding the individual to the state-run society were summarized by Norman Jacobs as, quote, excuse me, Chinese religion is a social religion seeking to solve the problems of social interests, not individual interests. Religion is essentially a force of impersonal social adjustment and control, rather than a medium for the personal solutions of the individual, and social adjustment and control are effected through the education and reverence for superiors. Reverence for superiors, superior in age and hence in education and experience, is the ethical foundation of social adjustment and control. In China, the interrelationship of political authority with orthodox religion equated heterodoxy with political error. The Orthodox religion was particularly active in persecuting and destroying heterodox sects. In this, it was backed by the secular power. So essentially, if you weren't arguing in what would be politically correct terms of their religious sect, then you were considered heterodox and fringe. Is that any different from today's status quo? No, it's not. If you say that the state is unnecessary and that markets can, in fact, produce and be more efficient than anything else, whether it be judicial security or military defense, then you are considered fringe and heterodox. It has not changed. The general tendency of government to seek out and thwart any heterodox views was outlined in typically witty and delightful style by the libertarian writer H.L. Mencken. What is the book? What is the book? A Mencken I forget how to pronounce it. Just look up H.L. Mencken, damn it. It's fantastic libertarian work. Moving on. All that government can see in an original idea is potential change and hence an invasion of its prerogatives. The most dangerous man to any government is the man who is able to think things out for himself without regard to the prevailing superstitions and taboos. Almost inevitably, he comes to the conclusion that the government he lives under is dishonest, insane, and intolerable, and so, if he is a romantic, he tries to change it. And even if he is not a romantic personally, he is very apt to spread discontent among those who are. This is the difference between Tim Pool saying he's a reformer and interjecting that Dave Smith is a radical. That's because that is the case. You can't reform something that's unreformable. This is why Dave Smith is essentially right. Whether we agree on strategy or not is irrelevant. He is correct. He needs to be a revolutionary. We need revolutionary change. There are some people that think this godforsaken structure can be saved. It cannot be. Moving on. It is also particularly important for the state to make its rule seem inevitable. Pretty good in rhetoric today, I might add. Even if its reign is disliked, as it often is, it will then be met with the passive resignation expressed in the familiar coupling of death and taxes. One method is to bring to its side historical determinism. If X state rules us, then this has been inevitably decreed for us by the inexorable laws of history, or the divine will, or the absolute, or the material productive forces, and nothing that any puny individuals may do change the inevitable. It is also important for the state to inculcate in its subjects an aversion to any outcropping of what is now called a conspiracy theory of history. Remember at this time that this was published in, I believe, 78. Okay, these ideas did not just creep up out of nowhere, all right? It's very, very relevant today. For a search for quote-unquote conspiracies, as misguided as the results often are, means a search for motives and an attribution of individual responsibility for the historical misdeeds of ruling elites. If, however, any tyranny or venality or aggressive war imposed by the state was brought about not by particular state rulers, but by mysterious and arcane social forces, or by the imperfect state of the world, or if in some way everyone was guilty, "We are all murderers," proclaims a common slogan, then there is no point in anyone's becoming indignant or rising up against such misdeeds. Furthermore, a discrediting of conspiracy theories, quote-unquote, or indeed anything smacking of economic determinism, will make its subjects more likely to believe the quote-unquote general welfare reasons that are invariably be put forth by the modern state for engaging in any aggressive actions. The rule of the state is thus made to seem inevitable. Furthermore, any alternative to the existing state is encased in an aura of fear. Neglecting its own monopoly of theft and predation, the state raises the specter among its subjects of the chaos that would supposedly ensue if the state should disappear. The people, on their own, it is maintained, could not possibly supply their own protection against sporadic criminals and marauders. Furthermore, each state has been particularly successful over the centuries in instilling fear among its subjects of other state rulers. Like now, they say if we break up, well, China will definitely rule over us then. There's just no doubt. If we were to secede as different states and become different nations, then we got a unipolar Chinese, Russian world, whichever boogeyman you choose to believe in. This isn't a new idea. The rhetoric that Tim Pool spews on civil war domestically and of China and Russia of externally and foreign policy has been around since way before I was born. We're talking millennia. This is not new. They use these boogeyman for a reason. With the land area of the globe now parceled out among particular states, one of the basic doctrines and tactics of the rulers of each state has been to identify itself with the territory it governs. Indivisible. Since most men tend to love their homeland, the identification of that land and its population with the state is a means of making natural patriotism work to the state's advantage. If then, quote-unquote, Ruritania is attacked by Waldavia, the first task of the Ruritanian state and its intellectuals is to convince the people of Ruritania that the attack is really upon them and not simply upon their ruling class. In this way, a war between rulers is converted into a war between peoples, with each people rushing to the defense of their rulers in the mistaken belief that the rulers are busily defending them. This device of nationalism has been particularly successful in recent centuries. It was not very long ago, at least in Western Europe, when the mass of subjects regarded wars as irrelevant battles between various sets of nobles and their retinues. And that's still today. People conflate governments with people. When our government goes over to placate the Saudis and the Saudis then inflict a genocide on Yemen, it is often conflated with those governments and the people. They say it's the Americans or it's the Saudis or it's the Yemenis, when in fact it's all the states of those places. Another tried and true method for bending subjects to one's will is the infusion of guilt. Any increase in private well-being can be attacked as unconscionable greed, materialism, or excessive affluence, and mutually beneficial exchanges in the market can be denounced as selfish. Somehow the conclusion always drawn is that more resources should be expropriated from the private sector and siphoned into the parasitic public or state sector. Often the call upon the public to yield more resources is couched in a stern call by the ruling elite for more sacrifices, quote-unquote, for the national or the commonweal. Somehow, however, while the public is supposed to sacrifice and curtail its materialistic greed, The sacrifices are always one way. The state does not sacrifice. The state eagerly grabs more and more of the public's material resources. Indeed, it is a useful rule of thumb. When your ruler calls aloud for sacrifices, look to your own life and pocketbook. This sort of argumentation reflects a general double standard of morality that is always applied to state rulers but not to anyone else. No one, for example, is surprised or horrified to learn that businessmen are seeking higher profits. No one is horrified if workers leave lower paying for higher paying jobs. All this is considered proper and normal behavior. But if anyone should dare assert that politicians and bureaucrats are motivated by the desire to maximize their incomes, the hue and cry of conspiracy theorists or economic determinists spreads throughout the land. The general opinion, carefully cultivated, of course, by the state itself, is that men enter politics or government purely out of devoted concern for the common good and the public weal. What gives the gentlemen of the state apparatus their superior moral patina? Perhaps it is the dim and instinctive knowledge of the populace that the state is engaged in systematic theft and predation, and they may feel that only a dedication to altruism on the part of the state makes these actions tolerable. To consider politicians and bureaucrats subject to the same monetary aims as everyone else would strip the Robin Hood veil from the state predation. For it would then be clear that, in Oppenheimer phrasing, ordinary citizens were pursuing the peaceful, productive economic means to wealth, while the state apparatus was devoting itself to the coercive and exploitative organized political means. The emperor's clothes of supposed altruistic concern for the commonweal would then be stripped from him. The intellectual arguments used by the state throughout history to engineer consent by the public can be classified in two parts. 1. That rule by the existing government is inevitable, absolute, and necessary, and far better than the indescribable evils that would ensue upon its downfall. And 2, that the state rulers are especially great, wise, and altruistic men, far greater, wiser, and better than their simple subjects. In former times, the latter argument took the form of rule by divine right, or by the divine ruler himself, or by an aristocracy of men. In modern times, as we indicated earlier, this argument stresses not so much divine approval as rule by a wise guild of scientific experts, especially endowed and knowledgeable of statesmanship and the arcane facts of the world. The increasing use of scientific jargon, especially in the social sciences, has permitted intellectuals to weave apologia for state rule which rival the ancient priestcraft of obscurantism. For example, a thief who presumed to justify his theft by saying that he was really helping his victims by his spending, thus giving retail trade a needed boost, would be hooted down without delay. But when the same theory is clothed in Keynesian mathematical equations and impressive references to the multiplier effect, it carries far more conviction with a bamboozled public. In recent years, we have seen the development in the United States of a profession of national security managers, of bureaucrats who never face electoral procedures but who continue through administration after administration, secretly using their supposed special expertise to plan wars, interventions, and military adventures. Only their egregious blunders in the Vietnam War have called their activities into any sort of public question. Before that, they were able to ride high, wide, and handsome over the public they saw mostly as cannon fodder for their own purposes, and that actually got rid of conscription, and since then we have been able to, for the most part, and people like Scott Horton and antiwar.com, them boys, have been able to show how egregious and blunderous their actions have been since the time of Vietnam. We have not declared a war, but have not stopped our military adventurism or imperialism. Not yet. A public debate between isolationist Senator Robert A. Taft and one of the leading that isolationist in quotations, because that wasn't the case. That's what they smeared him with. Robert A. Taft and one of the leading national security intellectuals, McGeorge Bundy, was instructive in demarking both the issues at stake and the attitude of the intellectual ruling elite. Bundy attacked Taft in early '51 for opening the public debate on the waging of the Korean War. Bundy insisted that only the executive policy leaders were equipped to manipulate diplomatic and military force in a lengthy decades-long period of limited war against the communist nations. It was important, Bundy maintained, that public opinion and public debate be excluded from promulgating any policy role in this area, for, he warned, the public was unfortunately not committed to the rigid national purposes discerned by the policy managers. It merely responded to the ad hoc realities of given situations. Bundy also maintained that there should be no recriminations or even examinations of the decisions of the policy managers, because it was important that the public accept their decisions without question. Taft, in contrast, denounced the secret decision-making by military advisors and specialists in the executive branch, decisions effectively sealed off from public scrutiny. Furthermore, he complained, quote, if anyone dared to suggest criticism or even thorough debate, he was at once branded an isolationist and saboteur of unity and the bipartisan foreign policy, unquote. You see why they dictated him as an isolationist, as they do all libertarians who are anti-war, for that matter. And you notice the word bipartisan. Often people advocate for things to be more bipartisan. There is nothing better than having a liberal president and a conservative Congress, because then it's in gridlock and they can't fucking move anything of the machinery of the government. Bipartisan is not good. It's not good. Neither is having all three branches covered by one where they can just steamroll shit through. That's not good either. But that's more rare than the bipartisan shit. There is, in fact, only one party. There's the Uniparty and the People. Those are your two parties. Moving on. Similarly, at the time when President Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles were privately contemplating going to war in Indochina, another prominent national security manager, George F. Kennan, was advising the public that there are times when, having elected a government, we will be best advised to let it govern and let it speak for us as it will in the councils of the nations. We see clearly why the state needs the intellectuals, but why do the intellectuals need the state? Put simply, the intellectual's livelihood in the free market is generally none too secure. For the intellectual, like everyone else on the market, must depend on the values and choices of the masses of his fellow men, and it is characteristic of these masses that they are generally uninterested in intellectual concerns. The state, on the other hand, is willing to offer the intellectuals a warm, secure, and permanent berth in its apparatus, a secure income, and the panoply of prestige. The eager alliance between the state and the intellectuals was symbolized by the avid desire of the professors at the University of Berlin in the 19th century to form themselves into what they themselves proclaimed as the intellectual bodyguard of the House of Hohenzollern. We see what that led to. From a superficially different ideological perspective, it can be seen in the revealingly outraged reaction of the eminent Marxist scholar of ancient China, Joseph Needham, to Karl Wittfogel's assiduous critique of ancient Chinese despotism. Wittfogel had shown the importance for bolstering the system of the Confucian glorification of the gentleman scholar officials who manned the ruling bureaucracy of despotic China. Needham charged indignantly that the civilization which Professor Wittfogel is so bitterly attacking was one which could make poets and scholars into officials. What matter the totalitarianism so long as the ruling class is abundantly staffed by certified intellectuals? The worshipful and fawning attitude of intellectuals toward their rulers has been illustrated many times throughout history. A contemporary American counterpart to the intellectual bodyguard of the House of Hohenzollern is the attitude of so many liberal intellectuals toward the office and person of the president, i.e. Obama. Thus, to political scientist Professor Richard Neustadt, the president is the sole crown-like symbol of the Union, and policy manager Townsend Hoops, in the winter of 1960, wrote that, quote, under our system, the people can look only to the president to define the nature of our foreign policy problem and the national programs and sacrifices required to meet it with effectiveness, unquote. After generations of such rhetoric, it is no wonder that Richard Nixon, on the eve of his election as president, should thus describe his role, quote, he, the president, must articulate the nation's values, define its goals, and marshal its will, unquote. Nixon's conception of his role is hauntingly similar to Ernst Huber's articulation in the Germany of the 1930s of the constitutional law of the Greater German Reich. Huber wrote that the head of the state, quote, sets up the great ends which are to be attained and draws up the plans for the utilization of all national powers in the achievement of the common goals. He gives the national life its true purpose and value, unquote. The attitude and motivation of the contemporary national security intellectual bodyguard of the state has been caustically described by Marcus Raskin, who was staff member of National Security Council during the Kennedy administration, calling them, quote, Megadeth intellectuals, unquote. Raskin writes that their most important function is to justify and extend the existence of their employers in order to justify the continued large-scale production of these thermonuclear bombs and missiles. Military and industrial leaders needed some kind of theory to rationalize their use. This became particularly urgent during the late 1950s, when economy-minded members of the Eisenhower administration began to wonder why so much money, thought, and resources were being spent on weapons if their use could not be justified. And so began a series of rationalizations by the quote-unquote defense intellectuals in and out of the universities. Military procurement will continue to flourish, and they will continue to demonstrate why it must. In this respect, they are no different from the great majority of modern specialists who accept the assumptions of the organizations which employ them because of the rewards in money and power and prestige. They know enough not to question their employer's right to exist. This is not to say that all intellectuals everywhere have been court intellectuals, servitors, and junior partners of power, but this has been the ruling condition in the history of civilizations, generally in the form of priestcraft, just as the ruling condition in those civilizations has been one or another form of despotism. There have been glorious exceptions, however, particularly in the history of Western civilization, where intellectuals have often been trenchant critics and opponents of state power and have used their intellectual gifts to fashion theoretical systems which could be used in the struggle for liberation from that power. But invariably, these intellectuals have only been able to arise as a significant force when they have been able to operate from an independent power base, an independent property base, separate from the apparatus of the state. For whenever the state controls all property, wealth, and employment, everyone is economically dependent on it, and it becomes difficult, if not impossible, for such independent criticism to arise. It has been in the West, with its decentralized foci of power, its independent sources of property and employment, and therefore of bases from which to criticize the state, where a body of intellectual critics has been able to flourish. In the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church, which was at least separate if not independent from the state, and the new free towns were able to serve as centers of intellectual and also substantive opposition. In later centuries, teachers, ministers, and pamphleteers in a relatively free society were able to use their independence from the state to agitate for further expansion of freedom. In contrast, one of the first libertarian philosophers, Lao Tzu, living in the midst of ancient Chinese despotism, saw no hope for achieving liberty in that totalitarian society except by counseling quietism to the point of the individuals dropping out of social life altogether. With decentralized power, with a church separate from the state, with flourishing towns and cities able to develop outside of the feudal power structure, and with freedom in society, the economy was able to develop in Western Europe in a way that transcended all previous civilizations. Furthermore, the Germanic, and particularly the Celtic, tribal structure which succeeded the disintegrating Roman Empire had strong libertarian elements. Instead of a mighty state apparatus exerting a monopoly of violence, disputes were solved by contending tribesmen consulting the elders of the tribe on the nature and application of the tribe's customary and common law. The chief was generally merely a war leader who was only called into his warrior role whenever war with the other tribes was underway. There was no permanent war or military bureaucracy in the tribes. In Western Europe, as in many other civilizations, the typical model of the origin of the state was not via a voluntary social contract, but by the conquest of one tribe by another. The original liberty of the tribe or the peasantry thus falls victim to the conquerors. At first, the conquering tribe killed and looted the victims and rode on, but at some time the conquerors decided that it would be more profitable to settle down among the conquered peasantry and rule and loot them on a more permanent and systematic basis. The periodic tribute exacted from the conquered subjects eventually came to be called taxation, and with equal generality, the conquering chieftains parceled out the land of the peasantry to the various warlords, who were then able to settle down and collect feudal rent from the peasantry. The peasants were often enslaved, or rather enserfed, to the land to provide a continuing source of exploited labor for the feudal lords. We may note a few prominent instances of the birth of a modern state through conquest. One was the military conquest of the Indian peasantry in Latin America by the Spaniards. The conquering Spanish not only established a new state over the Indians, but the land of peasantry was parceled out among the conquering warlords, who were ever after to collect rent from the tillers of the land. Another instance was the new political form imposed upon the Saxons of England after their conquest by the Normans in 1066. The land of England was parceled out among Norman warrior lords, who thereby formed a state and feudal land apparatus of rule over the subject population. For the libertarian, the most interesting and certainly the most poignant example of the creation of a state through conquest was the destruction of the libertarian society of ancient Ireland by England in the 17th century, a conquest which established an imperial state and ejected numerous Irish from their cherished land. The Libertarian Society of Ireland, which lasted for 1,000 years, and which will be described further below, was able to resist English conquest for hundreds of years because of the absence of a state which could be conquered easily and then used by the conquerors to rule over the native population. But while throughout Western history intellectuals have formulated theories designed to check and limit state power, each state has been able to use its own intellectuals to turn those ideas around into further legitimations of its own advance of power. Thus, originally in Western Europe, the concept of the divine right of king was a doctrine promoted by the church to limit state power. The idea was that the king could not impose his arbitrary will. His edicts were limited to conforming with the divine law. As absolute monarchy advanced, however, the kings were able to turn the concept around to the idea that God put a stamp of approval on anything of the king's actions, that he ruled by divine right. Similarly, the concept of parliamentary democracy began as a popular check on the absolute rule of the monarch. The king was limited by the power of parliament to grant him tax revenues. Gradually, however, as Parliament displaced the king as head of state, the Parliament itself became the unchecked state sovereign. In the early 19th century, English utilitarians who advocated additional individual liberty in the name of social utility and general welfare were to see these concepts turned into sanctions for expanding the power of the state, as de juvenile rights. Many writers on theories of sovereignty have worked out one or the other of these restrictive devices, but in the end, every such theory has sooner or later lost its original purpose and come to act merely as a springboard to power by providing it with the powerful aid of indivisible sovereign with whom it could in time successfully identify itself. All right, we're right around the hour and a quarter, which I've been limiting myself to as to not bore anybody who can't sit through long amounts of time. But so far we're getting to the critique of the state and the idea that the state is inevitable or infallible for that fact. We'll be recording more of these. Obviously, I've been uploading more and more content. It's very important to me that these ideas get out there, and maybe nobody hears them. Maybe it catches on and people come back and see it. Maybe people have read it but just want to return to it with a more contemporary context added to it, and that is what I am doing here. And if you enjoy this content, I certainly appreciate you. And if you could, please like, share, subscribe. I'll catch you on the next one.